The knock came just before midnight. "The Holy Father has asked for you," the Monsignor said, his voice trembling. "He's very sick, and he's asking for you by name." No cardinals, no cameras, just one dying request whispered into the silence between a pope and the one guard he trusted most. So, what exactly did Pope Francis say in those final moments? Lance Corporal Elias Koenig had been preparing for another quiet watch in the barracks of the Pontifical Swiss Guard, when the sound echoed through the stone corridor 3 knocks. "Deliberate, unmistakable." When he opened the door, Monsignor Ventresca stood in the half-light. The Pope's longtime personal secretary, his face usually composed behind a mask of Vatican discretion, bore something Elias had rarely seen there: genuine sorrow. "The Holy Father has asked for you," Ventresca said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias felt his chest tighten. No questions formed on his lips in the guard. You learned to obey first and wonder later. But deep within, he already knew. The whispers had been circulating through the sacred halls for days. Pope Francis was failing. His public appearances had ceased. The quiet preparations had begun. But to be called personally by name at this hour, this wasn't a duty shift. It was a farewell. His fingers, steady despite the weight pressing against his ribs, worked methodically through the familiar ritual of dressing tunic, buttoned precisely, sword belt secured, breastplate aligned perfectly over his chest. As he pulled on his white gloves, his fingertips brushed against something tucked into the inner lining of his jacket, a small wooden rosary gifted to him years ago by Pope Francis after one of their first private conversations. He carried it always unseen but ever present. Ventresca waited silently as Elias adjusted his bearskin helmet under his arm. Once ready, he simply nodded, and the two men moved together through the dim corridors of the barracks. The night air held an unusual stillness as they crossed the courtyard. St. Peter's Square stood empty, the massive colonnade embracing nothing but shadow and stone. No tourists, no cameras, just the weight of centuries watching their passage. They entered the Apostolic Palace through a side entrance rarely used, doors normally reserved for visiting dignitaries. Tonight, no ceremony announced their arrival, just the hushed echo of their footsteps against marble floors worn smooth by history. As they climbed a narrow stairwell, Elias's mind drifted back through the years to the quiet smiles Francis reserved for him after Mass, to the conversations where, improbably, a pontiff had chosen a young Swiss guard as confidant rather than merely protector, not seeking absolution but connection. Their bond had begun 7 years earlier when Elias was still new to Rome and to service. He had remained in the chapel long after morning Mass, kneeling alone in prayer. Most assumed the young guard was simply devout. Only Francis had recognized the weight of grief that kept him there. "You pray like a man who knows what it is to lose," Francis had said, approaching him that morning. Voice gentle with understanding. He'd been right. Elias had grown up in the mountainous canton of Uri, the youngest of 3 brothers. He was the only one to survive the avalanche that had claimed not just his family but half his village. Grief had carved him hollow, then rebuilt him with duty as his foundation. When he'd come to the Vatican, he sought not glory but purposa, place where silence was permitted, expected even. Ska. Francis had seen past the stoic uniform to the wounded soul beneath. Over the years, they had met often never officially scheduled, never recorded in Vatican logs. Sometimes in chapels after hours, sometimes in gardens when Francis claimed to have gotten lost during his evening walks. Always with a quiet understanding between them. Francis had seen past the stoic uniform to the wounded soul beneath. Over the years, they had met often never officially scheduled, never recorded in Vatican logs. Sometimes in chapels after hours, sometimes in gardens when Francis claimed to have gotten lost during his evening walks. Always with a quiet understanding between them. Dear were no grand confessions, No political discussions, just two men. One bearing the weight of the church, the other the weight of memory, finding in each other a reflection of wounds the world rarely allowed them to acknowledge. Titles weigh heavy, Elias Francis had once told him, but pain weighs heavier still. Better to have a few true souls near than 1,000 who only see your robes. As they reached the upper corridor of the apostolic palace, Elias noticed the unusual emptiness. Normally, even at this hour, some cardinal or prelate might be seen moving between chambers, some aide carrying documents. Tonight, the hallways stood deserted, as if the Vatican itself were holding its breath. Ventresca slowed his pace as they approached a modest wooden door. Not the ornate entrance to the papal apartments that Elias had expected, but a simpler threshold leading to what he knew were the Pope's private chambers. The rooms where Francis lived as a man, not just a pontiff. "He's been asking for you since sunset," Ventresca said softly, his hand resting on the door handle. The doctors wanted him to rest, but a small, sad smile touched the Monsignor's lips. "He can still be quite stubborn." Elias nodded, understanding completely. In their many conversations over the years, Francis had often joked about what he called his Argentine stubbornness, a quality that had both frustrated his advisers and endeared him to millions. Ventresca placed a hand lightly on Elias's shoulder. "He's waiting for you," he said quietly, then pushed the door open. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the soft amber glow of a single lamp. Shadows gathered in the corners like silent witnesses, but the center of the room seemed weightless, as if the very air had thinned out of reverence for its occupant. Pope Francis lay reclined against a modest stack of pillows, his breathing shallow but steady. His white cassock, once filled with the vigor of a man who traversed continents, hung loosely against his diminished frame. Yet when his gaze found Elias, his eyes held the same clear light they always had. With the faintest gesture of his fingers, he beckoned the guard forward. Elias approached with measured steps, the soles of his polished boots almost silent against the floor. He stopped a respectful distance from the bedside and stood at attention, fighting the urge to kneel, to break the formality that they had both, over time, come to understand was unnecessary between them. Monsignor Ventresca withdrew discreetly, the door closing with a barely audible click behind him. They were alone now, Pope and guard, yes, but more truthfully, two men meeting at the threshold between worlds. Francis shifted slightly, the movement requiring visible effort. He lifted one frail hand and pointed to a simple wooden chair positioned near the window, a silent invitation. Without hesitation, Elias moved to the chair and lowered himself onto it, removing his bearskin cap and resting it carefully on his knee. The crucifix on the opposite wall caught a fragment of lamplight, casting a thin shadow across the floor between them. Neither spoke for a long moment. Outside, the basilica bells told faintly midnight had passed. A new day had begun, though for one of them, days were growing precious and few. "You came," Francis finally whispered, his voice rough but warm. "Always," Elias replied, the word carrying the weight of a vow. "Toi." The Pope smiled faintly. "They told me you were off duty tonight." "I was never off duty for you, Holy Father." Francis's eyelids fluttered closed momentarily, as if gathering strength not for his next breath, but for his next thought. "I was thinking," he said, "how strange it is that in the end it's not the cardinals or the dignitaries I wish to see, not the scholars or the politicians." He opened his eyes again, fixing them on Elias with surprising clarity. "It's you." Elias bowed his head slightly, unsure if he should speak. He waited. "You were never just a guard," Francis murmured. "You were my witness." The words hung between them, heavier than any papal decree. "You listened when others preached. You saw when others turned away." Francis continued, each breath labored but deliberate. "You never demanded, never judged. You simply stood. Elias felt the sting of tears, but held them back, discipline written into every muscle of his body. I failed, Elias Francis said, voice breaking slightly. In my later years, I grew tired. I grew afraid. The world it pulled and twisted. Q did not fail, Elias said, the words escaping him unbidden. The Pope's laugh was gentle, almost a sigh. Even saints fail, my son, and I am no saint. He reached out, and Elias leaned closer so that Francis's hand could rest against his wrist. I called you here not for confession, Francis whispered, but for remembrance. Elias waited, the words settling like stone in his chest. Francis's hand tightened slightly around Elias's wrist, his voice dropping to a rasp, yet each syllable distinct and clear. When no one else remembers, you must. Elias closed his eyes, committing the words to memory, carving them into his heart alongside his grief, his duty, his faith. You must remember what we spoke about, when the marble halls forget, when the thrones change hands, when the cameras fade and the world moves on without me. Remember what it meant to care in silence. Elias opened his eyes and nodded once, a small gesture, but absolute in its promise. The Pope's hand fell away, exhausted by even this small effort. Outside, a night breeze stirred the curtains. Inside, a sacred covenant was sealed, invisible, yet more binding than any oath Elias had sworn under the guard's ancient flag. The room seemed to draw inward around them, tightening with each labored breath the Holy Father took. Rome slept beneath a veil of mist beyond the windows, unaware that within these walls the final moments of an era were unfolding in near-perfect silence. Elias remained close, watchful but respectful. His gloved hand rested on the chair's arm, ready if Francis should need him again. But the Pope's eyes remained closed, his face a portrait of exhaustion and peace intertwined. Minutes passed, perhaps hours. Time lost meaning in that sacred bubble between worlds. Then, as if rising from deep water, Francis stirred. "You are still here," he said, his voice so faint it barely carried across the small space between them. "I promised," Elias replied simply. Francis smiled weakly. "Good. Then listen one last time." Elias leaned closer, straining to catch every precious word. "In my youth," Francis began, "I thought power came from being heard, from speaking loudly, from leading crowds. A slow, rattling breath. But it was the quiet ones who carried the world. The ones who listened when no one else would. The ones who stood even when there was no glory in standing." He paused, eyelids fluttering with the effort of speaking. "You were among them, Elias. Always among them." Elias swallowed hard, feeling his heart press against his ribs, not from fear or grief, but from the unbearable honor of these words being entrusted to him. Francis's fingers found the edge of Elias's sleeve, curling weakly around the fabric. "I saw you praying alone that first day. Thought you were a statue," he murmured, a ghost of humor warming his voice. "Then I realized you were speaking more to God in that silence than I had in all my sermons." Elias shifted slightly, his eyes burning. He hadn't expected this unburdening, this stripping away of the final layers that separated Pope from man. "I envied you," Francis confessed. "Your faith wasn't complicated. It was pure." Elias shook his head gently. "I'm not pure, Holy Father. Only trying." Francis's hand gave the smallest squeeze. "Trying is all," he asks. The lamp flickered briefly, sending shadows dancing across the walls like memories given momentary form. The Pope's breathing grew shallower, each inhale more labored than the last. After a long pause, Francis opened his eyes one final time, fixing Elias with a gaze that penetrated every shield he had ever raised. "There will come a time," he said, "when men will forget why we stood guard, when tradition will be mistaken for vanity, when silence will be mistaken for indifference." His voice faltered, but he pressed on, the words coming slower now, each one carefully shaped with the last of his strength. Remember that love without noise is still love, a final, fragile breath, and that service without audience is still service. Elias bowed his head, unable to hold back the tears that slid silently down his cheeks, but he made no sound. His shoulders did not shake. His posture did not bend. He wept as a god weeps silent, reverent. Francis closed his eyes one last time, and they did not reopen. His hand slipped gently from Elias's sleeve to rest against the linen bedsheet. Outside, a distant bell told once not the solemn announcement of papal passing, but the quiet marking of an hour. Unaware that time had shifted irrevocably inside these walls, Elias remained kneeling by the bedside, the Pope's final charge echoing in his mind like a sacred vow. When no one else remembers, you must ... and he would. He would carry it not as a burden, but as a trust of final duty, not of arms or armor, but of memory. The room stood suspended in stillness, untouched by the world's relentless forward motion. Even time itself seemed to pause in reverence. He stayed kneeling, muscles aching from stillness but welcoming the discomfort. It felt right, a final act of devotion to the man who had once stooped to touch the soul beneath a soldier's armor. Monsignor Ventresca returned quietly, his steps so measured they seemed to blend with the silence rather than break it. He paused a respectful distance away, hands clasped before him, head slightly bowed. No words passed between them. None were needed. Two Vatican aides appeared soon after, their faces solemn in the dim light. They hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to proceed or leave this sacred vigil undisturbed. Ventresca gave a small nod, permitting their entry. They approached with the reverence of men who understood they were witnessing not merely a death, but the closing of an era. Gently, they began the ancient rites prayers, murmured softly, the sign of the cross traced over Francis's forehead. Still, Elias remained motionless, not from obligation, not from protocol, but from choice. He was the living embodiment of the Pope's last requesta, guardian not of a throne but of a truth past. From one soul to another in the quiet between worlds, when the aides had completed their duties, one approached Elias with careful steps. "You may be dismissed, Corporal," he said softly. Elias didn't move immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Pope Francis's hands, now folded peacefully across his chest. After a moment, he rose not with military precision, but with reverent grace. He retrieved his bearskin cap from the chair and tucked it under his arm. Spar at the threshold. He paused. He turned once, offering a final salute, not the sharp parade ground gesture demanded by protocol, but a slow, respectful movement. A farewell between two men whose connection had transcended title and rank. Then he stepped back into the corridor, leaving behind not just a room but a chapter of his life, now sealed forever in his heart. The marble beneath his boots felt colder, each step heavier with the knowledge of what he now carried. Not a secret, a sacred trust. When no one else remembers, you must. Outside, the first pale light of dawn touched the Vatican gardens. A new day was beginning. But for Elias Koenig it was a different kind of dawn, one marked not by the rising sun but by the quiet inheritance of a final plea. He did not look back. Some moments, he knew, were meant to be left behind, carried forward only in spirit. The heavy oak door closed behind him with a soft thud, and Elias stood alone in the narrow corridor. The cool air of the apostolic palace brushed against his face like a final blessing. The marble walls, witnesses to centuries of history, seemed to absorb his footsteps as he moved steadily back toward the life he had always known but would never see the same way again. Throughout the palace, the first subtle signs of awareness were beginning. Staff moved with hushed urgency. Prelates gathered in small clusters, their voices low. Soon bells would toll, announcements would be crafted, ceremonies planned. The machinery of papal transition would awaken with all its somber pageantry. But none of that was Ilias's concern now. He was no longer just a guard on duty. He was the keeper of something precious. Memory, a message, a final whisper passed from a dying soul to a living one. Key crossed through the side courtyard where his fellow guards changed posts silently, halberds gleaming in the growing light. No one stopped him. No one questioned his presence. In the unspoken language of soldiers and servants, some things required no explanation. In his small room in the barracks, Elias began the ritual of removing his uniform. First, the breastplate, set carefully on its wooden stand. Then his gloves, peeled from his fingers with deliberate care. Piece by piece, he shed the armor of ceremony until only the man beneath remained raw, humbled, altered. From inside his uniform jacket, he retrieved the wooden rosary Pope Francis had given him. Its beads were smooth from countless prayers, its cross worn by the touch of many vigils. He placed it gently on his nightstand and sat on the edge of his cot, hands resting on his knees, the weight of the night finally settling upon him. There were no tears now. Those had been shed in the sacred silence of that room. There was only a vow, an unspoken oath, more binding than anything he had sworn under arms. When no one else remembers, you must. He would remember. He would remember the kindness hidden beneath formality, the gentle hand on a grieving guard's shoulder when the world seemed unbearable, the shared laughter in quiet gardens when protocol demanded distance, the wisdom offered not from pulpits but through the simple act of seeing another soul completely. Elias rose and crossed to the small desk against the wall. From a drawer, he took a simple notebook, its pages mostly blank. He opened to the first page and, in careful handwriting, wrote a single line. Remembrance begins in silence. He closed the book without writing more. Some promises, he knew, were too sacred for paper. Instead, they lived in actions, in choices, in the steady gaze of a man who understood that true loyalty wasn't proclamation, it was persistence. The quiet courage to carry forward a flame that others could not see. In the days that followed, the world mourned as expected. St. Peter's Square filled with crowds holding candles. Dignitaries arrived in solemn procession. News cameras captured every public moment of grief and ceremony. But none witnessed the quiet ritual Elias began each morning before dawn, a moment of prayer with the wooden rosary, a page added to his journal, not with grand reflections but with simple memories. The way Francis had laughed at a sparrow that once interrupted their conversation, his fondness for the worn leather shoes he refused to replace despite protocol, the strength in his hands despite his age hands that had blessed millions but had also once simply held Ilias's own when words failed them both. A week after the funeral, when the cardinals had gathered for conclave and the world's attention had shifted to speculation about succession, Elias was assigned to guard the small private chapel where Francis had often prayed alone. It was a routine post, away from public view. As he stood his watch in the empty chapel, a cardinal he didn't recognize entered and knelt in prayer. After some time, the elderly man approached Elias with curious eyes. "You're Koenig, aren't you?" he asked quietly. "The one who was with him at the end." Elias gave a small nod, surprised to be known. The cardinal studied him thoughtfully. "He mentioned you, you know? Many times." A pause. "He said you understood something the rest of us often forget." Elias waited, uncertain. "That the church isn't made of marble and gold," the cardinal continued. "It's made of moments no one sees." With that, he touched Ilias's arm lightly and left, his red cassock disappearing through the doorway. At night, as the bells of St. Peter's rang out to announce the election of a new pope, Elias stood alone by his window, watching as celebration filled the square below. As he stood vigil, he felt not the weight of loss, but the warmth of a trust passed from one heart to another. He touched the rosary once more, And he smiled not with joy but with gratitude, because he had been chosen, and he would not forget. Would you have the strength to carry someone's final words if they trusted you with their dying breath? What do you think Pope Francis meant when he whispered, "When no one else remembers, you must"? If the world forgot the meaning behind our oldest traditions, would you have the courage to keep that flame alive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone and truly value your perspective. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss another powerful story about honor, duty, and the quiet heroes who guard more than just gates and palaces. Share this video with someone who understands that the greatest promises are often spoken in whispers. Our other stories are appearing on your screen now. Choose one to watch next, and we'll see you tomorrow with another unforgettable journey into the heart of true service.